I am Dr. Sabrina Dent. I am the president for the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. For those who are not familiar with the center, we are an independent nonprofit educational organization and theological think tank based in Richmond, Virginia, on the beautiful campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary. And we are a community of scholars, faith leaders, organizers, and citizens that are dedicated to being and building a beloved community in Virginia and beyond. We are committed to embarking on a bold journey of living our faith and advancing justice and building sustainable paths for authentic reconciliation and community. Just like tonight's program, the center offers a variety of educational opportunities for people to engage, not just people, but for students, congregations, community leaders, and faith leaders, as well as public officials that center around advancing justice and building cultures for reconciliation. We recognize that this work takes all of us, and we're glad that you have joined us this evening. And this is also why we have collaborated with our many different partners to have this discussion, because it's necessary for us to build what we call the beloved community. So with that, I want to thank our partners at Union Presbyterian Seminary and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation for partnering with us on tonight's program. And so with that, I would like to invite Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, who is the director for the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, to give a few remarks. Dr. Sadler.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dent. This is indeed an honor and a blessing to be able to partner with you on such wonderful programming. As we talk about tonight, our voices, our votes, our freedoms, we are in the midst of a significant time period here in this nation, and we need to talk about voting. We need to make sure that we are putting this front and center of the work that we're doing in any organization with which we're working. We at the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation are the organ of Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that focuses on the prophetic dimensions of pastoral and teaching ministry. We want to make sure that the church is always held accountable to do what thus says the Lord, and thus says the Lord as always, to provide justice and care for those least, lost, and otherwise left out. We're doing a lot of good work that we are pleased to be able to partner with the Center for Faith, Justice and Reconciliation on, and I want to invite you all to come back and talk about some of that work as well. We've got a few events that are coming up in the next month or so, wrestling with the history of race in voting in the United States, in Charlotte, North Carolina in particular. So many of these things are mutual works, and there's so many people that are doing this today. So I'm glad to be able to partner with the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, and indeed so many other groups that are working to bring about a more just, more fair, more equitable world, and an America where every vote is protected and everyone's rights are respected. God bless you all, and look forward to being with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadler, for those comments, and we're delighted to partner with you as well. So with that, we're going to move forward with our program. And I want to start by saying that this program is not one that we approached lightly. History has shown us that there are many actors in society who are willing to silence the voices of marginalized communities at any cost. On January 15th in the state of Virginia, we saw that the newly elected governor signed 11 executive orders that threatened the ideals of democracy, human dignity, and even public safety. Moreover, we have learned that voter suppression is real and has moral implications for all citizens. In 2019 and 2021, alone, 19 states enacted 34 new laws that restricted access to the ballot box, and more are under construction even today. Just a few weeks ago, we saw incredible efforts, advocacy efforts, calling on our senators to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. And yet those efforts failed miserably due to partisan politics. Tonight's program, Our Voices, Our Votes, Our Freedoms, is an invitation for all of us to learn and to listen and to take action on issues that impact our communities, not just on a federal level, but in our local context. This evening, you will hear from thought leaders, scholars, organizers, and policymakers who are putting their faith in action to address the role of religion and the role that it has played in politics, which impacts voting rights, social justice, religious freedom, environmental justice, and things that impact our daily lives. So with that, I am honored to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. Dr. Walker is the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities in North Carolina, and we're so delighted that he's joined us this evening. At the same time, Dr. Walker is an author of many books, including the book African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities. We also have with us this evening Dr. Leslie Copeland, who is the Chief Operating Officer for the National Council of Churches, USA, and is one of America's notable ecumenical leaders and tireless advocate for justice. Currently, she serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the National Council of Churches, and previously she served as the Associate Director for Justice and Advocacy, and as the Director for the NCC's Act Now to End Racism program. And so we're delighted to have Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland with us as well. Then we also have with us this evening, Dr. Sharon J. Grant, who is the Associate Professor of History of Christianity at Hood Theological Seminary. Dr. Grant teaches, she teaches courses on the history of Christianity, and has also taught for our class at the Religious Freedom Center, which was African Americans and Religious Freedom, a course that was introduced to many seminarians that are enrolled at historically Black colleges and universities. She is the author of numerous scholarly papers related to the topic, and is a former environmental scientist. So that information is very significant for tonight's conversation as well. Dr. Grant, we are delighted that you are with us as also the founding director of the International Center of Faith, Science, and History. So welcome, Dr. Grant. I would like to also welcome Maggie Siddiqi, who is the Senior Director of Religion and Faith at the Center for American Progress. Maggie is, as I stated, the Director of Religion and Faith at the Center for American Progress, where she advances a progressive vision of faith and religious liberty and engages a network of faith leaders. Previously, she served in a leadership position at the El Hebrew Foundation and the Islamic Society of North America's Office for Interfaith and Community Alliances. She also served as a program director for American Muslim Health Professionals and founded its Enable Muslim Network to provide support for individuals living with disabilities and their loved ones. Maggie, thank you for joining us this evening. And finally, we have with us Amanda Tyler. Amanda Tyler is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. She leads the organization in upholding the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against the establishment by the government. She is an attorney with privileges at the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar, and is often asked to provide commentary on church-state issues. Under her leadership, the BJC initiated the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign and recently published a report, Christian Nationalism and the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Amanda Tyler is also a member of the board of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, as well as Dr. Corey D.B. Walker. So I am delighted to have all of you with us tonight for this conversation, and I will turn it over to you, Dr. Walker.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. It's truly an honor to be here tonight with such a group of scholars, dedicated activists, and longtime organizers and long distance runners in the freedom movement to take on this critical question and this critical theme of our voices, our votes, and what we're trying to, and our voices, our votes, and what's the last?
Freedoms.
Our freedom.
Freedoms.
That's going to be the most important conversation tonight, our freedoms. So before we begin, I want to contextualize tonight's conversation by going back roughly about 3 decades. And 3 decades ago, we find this particular event that helps give some context to tonight's conversation. There is a religious war going on in our country. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War. For this war is the war for the soul of America. Pat Buchanan's declaration was bracing on the opening night of the 1992 Republican National Convention. In our current moment, it is understated in capturing the open conflict that dramatizes our moment. Indeed, what was a call to political revolution in 1992 has become an apt description of an open state of insurrectionary democracy in 2022, reminding us that critical and sustained attention must be given to America's long religious war. In a moment when the nation is embroiled in an intense struggle over the substance as well as the future of democracy in America, it is imperative to understand how and in what ways the languages, practices, rituals, ideas, and institutions of religion have effectively usurped the language of politics. Our political conjuncture is not just the struggle over the good, but rather how to enact the very politics of God in a pluralist, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, an experiment in democracy that has yet to be undertaken in the history of the world. Tonight, we want to focus in on the challenges that we face, the opportunities for democratic renewal, and most importantly, how we can galvanize ourselves and our communities to bring about a more righteous future for all of humanity and all of life. I'd like to begin by first situating us and capturing a glimpse of our complex and contested moment by speaking with our distinguished guests and having them really articulate the nature of the political conjuncture that we find ourselves in now. I'd like to begin with my dear colleague, Leslie. Leslie, how do you understand the big issues that we're confronting in our contemporary moment?
Thank you, Dr. Walker. It's so great to be with you all this evening. My friends, Maggie and Amanda, Dr. Grant, you as well, Dr. Sabrina Dent and Dr. Sadler, all of whom I've had the blessed ability to work with. When you ask that question, the first thing that jumps into my mind is a mess, right? Like that we're just in a mess, to use a deep theological terminology. But we do find ourselves in this really strange position. When you quoted Pat Robertson talking about the soul of America, I could relate to that in some ways, because I feel like that this moment has us really in a struggle and a fight for really the souls of a nation that is at a crossroads in many ways. I know we sometimes overuse that, but are we going to be a democracy, or are we going to give in to insurrectionists? And so while we're in this moment, are you all hearing me okay? Because I think there was some static at one point. So, when we talk about our voices and our votes, our freedoms, and we talk about this moment, it's so interesting how when we begin to see progress from our history, there's always a backlash, right? And so we're kind of in a moment where we're getting this huge blowback after seeing some understanding of what racism looks like after George Floyd and after Ahmaud Arbery, after Breonna Taylor. Like it seemed like the whole world was watching, and we were all out in the streets together. Many of us were out in the streets together. We thought there was progress that was going to be made, and then next thing you know, we're in this moment where not only is there January 6th, but there has become a new boogeyman, be very, very afraid of critical race theory, which is just nonsense based on what it actually is and what we're really talking about. I remember growing up and often hearing, when we talked about reparations for slavery, often hearing white people say something along the lines of, I didn't have anything to do with that. It was my, foreparents, and it has nothing to do with me. I shouldn't have to pay reparations. Well, now the conversation seems to be moving in a direction where it's, I don't even want to hear about what happened, right? That I want to erase it, that I want to ignore it, that I don't want my children to even know about it, because somehow their sensibilities, it's going to be too much for them. But it's not too much for Black children to learn racism by being called out of their name or being mistreated from the time they're in, start preschool all the way through the education system and even just in society. I think about my mother in a moment like this, who sat in at lunch counters, my grandparents who, with a middle school education, used to teach people in the backcountry of South Carolina how to fill out the form so that they can vote. And then we're in this moment where we're fighting again for the same kinds of freedoms about voting. But after sometime around the George Floyd incident, my mother said something that I just want to share. She said, we are not going back, right? She's like, we can go up together, we can figure this out, but we're not going back. And I think that speaks really to the commitment of so many of us who are out here organizing and reorganizing and trying to figure out how to get around some of the voter suppression laws that are out there that have gone from how many jelly beans are in this jar, right, to you can't hand out water if people have to stand in line for 8 hours to vote, or you can't, have boxes where people can drop off their vote so that they can go to work and don't have to take off time just to vote. And so I think it is a critical moment. It is a mess of a moment, because we're having to not only figure out ways to really remessage, repackage, reinvigorate even our own selves. I know somebody else on this call feels a little weary, as I often do, about having to still have to be doing kind of fighting some of the fights that have already been fought. But we're resilient, and I think that the fact that we have we're embracing our voices and we're using our voices in this moment speaks to the fact that we aren't giving up and we aren't going to, that victory. I heard LaTosha Brown say today that our deadline is victory, right? Like, so that we're going to continue in this fight. I share that because I had to write it down. I was like, that is I think where we are, that regardless of what they're throwing our way in this moment, regardless, because, and let me say it like this too, that the fact that we're having to fight in a democracy to vote, it is a matter of freedom, right? It's a matter of what kinds of freedoms will we be able to continue to celebrate and to have. Is this going to be a democracy, or is it going to be something very different? And so I think that is what fuels me and fuels many of us who have been fighting for this in this fight that we're in. And it's that gives us the resilience that I think we need so that, so that we do have a victory in the end. So I went way off script there of my notes, but I hope that at least kind of sets the stage or conversation as to this moment that we're in now.
No, Leslie, you provided us with an apt entry into the conversation. The idea that that you articulated, that we're in a moment that can best be characterized as a moment expressed theologically. It is a theology of the mess, the very messiness of democracy. That democracy is an unfinished product. It is still very much an experiment. It is something that we're going to have to fight and struggle for. And what we're seeing across these different formations, from voting rights to the rights and articulation of those marginalized individuals in our democratic society, to the exercise, the full expression of those freedoms, have been curtailed in our moment. So I really like the way in which you framed our conversation. This is a theology of the mess. And in many ways, this is what we're going to have to keep into account and keep developing. So with that idea of a theology in the mess, I turn to my dear colleague, Sharon Grant, who's at one of our historic theological institutions, Hood Theological Seminary in Salisbury, North Carolina. Sharon, you've been involved in developing and articulating a broad perspective of religious freedom. You're now heading up a center that's bringing together questions of faith, the deep, complex issues of science, as well as how we understand this within the flow of history. Sharon, how do you understand this particular moment, our particular conjunctural moment, as you're on the front lines of training the next generation of faith leaders in our society?
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Again, a pleasure to be with the panelists. Dr. Dent, thank you again for the invitation. Yes, we are in a mess. And unfortunately, sometimes religion can make the mess even more toxic. And so we're in the work of removing the toxicity of religion. And for me, that is the work that is profoundly based in decentering. We're having to decenter the Eurocentric perspective that has basically commodified everything that we see, even down to our DNA is being commodified for the persons who are the titans of capital industry. So the work of decentering not just the European perspectives and ideologies that are so harmful, but also as we look at the mess of the planet that we're in right now, we're going to have to decenter even humanity from being viewed as the center of the cosmos. That's critically and vitally important, because we are not just using nature as resources, we're in relationship with nature. And those are the kinds of things that indigenous religions understood, other forms of Christianity outside of the Western framework of Christianity understood. We're going to have to get back to understanding what it means to be in relationship, not just with one another, with people who we don't necessarily agree with all the time. We got to figure out how to construct a society that works for everybody. And so that is the work that I see that is so vitally important, doing the work of decentering, not just the European voices, doing the work of decentering, removing human beings from a top of a hierarchy and being in relationship with nature. And for me, I see that it's time for human beings, especially for those of us in the United States, to become more scientifically literate. That's really going to be what gives us the methodology to remove a lot of the myths, a lot of the long-held toxic opinions. But so we realized through this pandemic that persons have various ways of using science, and so I think that there is room for peer-reviewed science to look at what is actually life-affirming and what is actually not life-affirming, what is actually causing life to be conscribed and to be limited. So as the world begins to become more and more dependent upon science and technology, we actually need to have a scientifically literate population. So I'm working with AAAS, and they've got a project called Project 2061. It's a long-term research and development initiative that is basically saying we want a scientifically literate population by the time we get to 2061. So we're starting to see over the last few years a lot more intentionality as it relates to STEM education. But we don't just get there through science. We have to have meaning. We have to have passion. We have to have love and hope. And that's where the religion piece comes in. It gives us the ethos. It gives us the passion and the language to actually build alliances that can create some coercive power and move some of this institutional entrenchment so that we can actually create the policies that can make sure that we've got clean water, make sure that we've got clean air, make sure that we've got soil for food security as these storms caused by climate change get more and more intense and our crops are becoming threatened. So that's really the work that I see that we have to do, continue the work of decentering. There is a theological framework called eco-womanism that privileges the voices like Leslie Copeland's mother, that said that the voices of poor Black women that have been catching HELL in this country have something to say that is life-affirming and that includes everybody. Nobody has to be excluded. Nobody has to be marginalized. There's room at the table for everybody, but we have to come correct. We have to come with an intentionality that we see and affirm one another's humanity. And so eco-womanism privileges the voices of poor Black women and also seeks to have this relationship with nature that can be healing and bring us back to a place of balance. And so that is the work that I see, decentering and building alliances to move this institutional entrenchment that has us in this mess right now.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Tonight, folks, if you're listening, make sure you're taking copious notes. We have a theology of the mess that really crystallizes the existential crisis that we're in right now. And Sharon Grant has just offered us a politics that can be operative in this moment, and that is a politics of decentering. And that decentering means that we have to look at the ways in which religion serves both as a medicine to help us, but also in some ways can serve to enhance the very toxic nature of our political moment. But she also expands the frame of what of our contemporary moment to say that the politics of decentering is not only about judicial arrangements or legislative arrangements, it's about the very arrangement of life itself on this earth. This is about the future of organized life. This is what we're facing. So this politics of decentering is coupled with Professor Copeland's idea of a theology of the mess. And I'm going to turn to my dear friend, Maggie, because Maggie reminds us of something in her deep work in understanding that this world is a deeply diverse world. It's a religiously plural world. And if we're going to do a politics of decentering, it seems that we're going to have to understand that the politics of religion in American public life just doesn't revolve around the varieties of Christianity or even the varieties of the broader Abrahamic tradition of Judaism and Islam. It's going to revolve around how we deal with the question of religious pluralism in a deep, democratic, and diverse society. So Maggie, how do you understand our contemporary moment in light of the deep pluralism that we're experiencing in society today?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be a part of this conversation. And you're right, we're not, I think, effectively speaking about the rich religious diversity in this country, as well as thinking about what it means to build a more inclusive democracy, one that has not yet existed in this country, but one that we hope to bring into reality. Unfortunately, where faith in public life is most visible is in the instances when it shocks us, as it should, like the Jesus Saved signs that we saw at the violent insurrection on January 6th of last year. It should shock us in those instances. We should not expect to see a violent distortion of the message of the Prince of Peace like that. We should be worried about the implications of that kind of ideology of violent white Christian nationalism, but we should not then make the mistake of letting this kind of shocking event define what faith in public life looks like for the majority of Americans. Because it's really important to remember that people who hold onto a religious tradition or faith values of any kind do engage with their faith every single day in public life. Their faiths inform why they are calling for voting rights, why they are advocating for racial justice, for economic justice, for action on climate change, and so on. We don't all wear our religion on our sleeves or on our heads, in my case, when we do that work, but it's important to, to tell that story, because people who claim religion as a cover or claiming religion in the public square they're claiming all of religion in the public square for us. At the Center for American Progress, we wrote a report about all of the ways that religious communities are engaged in the pro-democracy movement, specifically in the lead up to the 2020 election. I will drop that in the chat right there. And what became clear in our analysis is that the vast majority of Americans, people of all faith backgrounds, geographies, racial and ethnic groups, are all united around a set of common values and principles that lead them to advocate for an America in which all people have the right to equal voice and equal vote in our country. And by contrast, folks on the right wing in our country have openly embraced anti-democratic views. As Senator Reverend Warnock said, they're focused on winning at any cost, even the cost of democracy itself. And as I said before, what's especially relevant here is that they use religion and Christianity specifically as a cover for this agenda. Now, I'm proud to live in a country where we welcome faith and non-faith in the public square. And we should be clear that what they are advocating for is not for Christianity in the public square. They are advocating for a country in which white Christian men are the public square, because they believe America should be defined around the needs and whims of white Christian men alone. That impulse is obviously white supremacist, it's Christian nationalist, and then by logical extension must be anti-democratic, because the best way to maintain your power over others is to take away their ability to have any say in what happens to them. We saw in 2020, to end on a more positive note, this a beautiful mobilization of diverse religious communities coming together to protect the election results, no matter the outcome. And as I think it was Reverend Leslie's mother said, we're not going back. It's definitely an uphill battle, but I do think things are getting worse because ultimately they're going to get better. And to back that up with some scripture from my tradition, the Quran says, with hardship, there is ease. Not after hardship, with hardship, there is ease. And so I believe that some people in our country are losing their grasp on power. And so they're going to make some hardship for us about that. But that's because a broader group of people are now embracing a new vision, one that, God willing, will provide greater ease. And that ease is a more just and more inclusive democracy.
Thank you so much, Maggie. And of course, you provide us with a way of really understanding our moment, but that not only is analytical, it also provides us with the normative resources to continue on. With hardship, there is ease. And we understand that from deep, deep, rich traditions of Islam, the deep, rich traditions of Afro-Christianity, the deep Jewish traditions, and all religious traditions offer us these particular resources. And you're right to remind us that religion operates within this dialectic of ideology and this dialectic of the ideal. And it is that ideal that we must embrace, because there are far more who embrace the notion of religion and the resources of religion to help us build that inclusive democracy. So with that, I would like to turn to our dear friend, Amanda. Amanda, we've heard about religion as both ideology and its worst guides, but also in an ideal moment as a balm, if you will, that enables us to build democracy. It requires that we operationalize a politics of decentering and dealing with this theological moment that we're in, that's really crystallized by that profound concept of mess. You're on the front lines at this historic institution, the BJC. It's been fighting for deep religious freedom. You're leading the BJC in this moment. How do you understand our contemporary moment, particularly as it relates to some of the judicial issues and legal issues that we confront in our particular moment?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Corey, and as always for your incredibly astute moderating of these perspectives as we bring this all together, and to my panelists for your brilliant comments. You know, as I was reflecting and thinking about the theology of the mess, Leslie, I was thinking about, and all this, my common theme is going to be, to understand all of this, we have to understand Christian nationalism. We have to understand how it is the urgent threat to American democracy, how it is completely antithetical to religious freedom for all, the freedom to choose whatever religion or to choose not to be religious, and how we have to understand Christian nationalism and work to dismantle it. And Christian nationalism at its core tries to tidy up that mess, to say that God has ordained everything that the United States has done in its past and its present and its future. And that confuses us because we know what a mess America has been at all of these different points in time. And from my own tradition as a Christian, I can't imagine that God would ever ordain slavery or terrorism by lynching or segregation or any of the other ills that America has committed and sins that America has committed over time. So to understand Christian nationalism shows how it's fighting against even a concept of America as a mess. And of course, Christian nationalism centers a Eurocentric perspective about everything. And again, says that that is God ordained. And so if we're going to deal with decentering, if we're going to accomplish decentering, we have to tackle Christian nationalism. And, you know, Maggie says it so well that we've taken the public square, that they're white Christian men are taking over the public square. That's exactly the issue. And so I think what we have to do is provide an alternative to religious engagement in the public square. And one example of that way to engage is the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project that BJC has organized as an ecumenical project that has brought together many different Christians from all different perspectives and theologies. To date, we have more than 24,000 individual Christians who have joined this movement, and it continues to grow from more than 6 different denominational perspectives. And at the heart of it is this set of unifying principles that we believe can bring Christians together to understand Christian nationalism, how it impacts our own theology, and our responsibility to dismantle it in the public square. And so just to lead off, I wanted to share some of those principles and how I think that can help us take action. The very first principle of that statement is that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And this rebuts one of the key misunderstandings about the, quote, separation of church and state. That concept, which is key to the constitutional protection of religious freedom in this country, was never meant to remove religion from the public square. And in fact, I believe that people of faith, and particularly Christians, because that's my perspective, have a responsibility to speak up against Christian nationalism. And while we all have a right and responsibility to engage, this initiative is needed because some who have spoken for Christians have exacerbated the problem. And so it is our duty to provide a counter narrative to those voices. Another of the principles at the heart of Christians Against Christian Nationalism is that patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. We're trying to draw a difference here between patriotism, which is love of country, and nationalism, which is a fidelity to country that demands allegiance before all of our other allegiances, including our religious allegiances. And if our patriotism causes us to sacrifice our theological convictions, then it has ceased to be patriotism and it is nationalism. And so we have to reclaim that idea of patriotism, that it is patriotic to protest our government, and it is prophetic to speak truth to power. And we can do both as we push back against Christian nationalism. Another one of the principles is that one's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. That our standing in society, our sense of belonging, should not at all be tied to our religious identity. And yet, because of the influence of Christian nationalism in the United States, it often is. And I think it's the responsibility of those of us, white Christians, who have benefited the most from Christian nationalism to speak this truth boldly and to model inclusivity in the public square. And finally, I want to say that one of the principles in the statement is we must stand up to and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship against religious communities at home and abroad. And this point brings home that this is not a theoretical conversation. We have seen how Christian nationalism in the hands of violent extremists can turn deadly. It did on June 17th, 2015 at Mother Emanuel AME Church. It did on October 27th, 2018 at Tree of Life Synagogue. It did on January 6th, 2021 at the US Capitol. And as has been mentioned, BJC and Christians Against Christian Nationalism and Freedom from Religion Foundation just put out a new report last week on Christian nationalism in January 6th. And it's a really important resource to understand how Christian nationalism intensified and bolstered, and in the eyes of the insurrectionists, justified their indefensible actions. And to understand that threat to democracy, we have to understand Christian nationalism.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Your work with Christians against Christian nationalism is admirable. It reminds us that the very idea of wedding religious power to the power of the state is anathema to a robust civic life and the robustness of building an inclusive democracy. More importantly, it reminds us that there are deep separations between the operations of statecraft and the politics of religion in the essence of religion. So it's a moment where you're offering us a moment to reflect that this theology of a mess that we're in has its deep analogs and deep foundations in the operationalizing in our contemporary moment of a Christian nationalism. What I'd like to do is invite our guests, our audience with us who joined us tonight to submit your questions right to our chat feature or right to the Q&A feature. We'll grab those in the conversation, but we're going to continue with this theme on Christian nationalism, or wedding the power of the state and the power of religion together. And I want to ask Leslie, Leslie, it seems that this idea of Christian nationalism that manifests itself in these virulent acts at Mother Emanuel AME Church, of course, at Tree of Life Synagogue, and at the nation's capital just last year. There are those who advocate for Christian nationalism that then read everything as antithetical to the state, including a critical understanding and analysis of how anti-Black racism works. A question of critical race theory. Right now, it's like the boogeyman. It's everywhere. It's being taught to kindergartners. It's being taught in preschools. Critical race theory is everywhere. But yet, much like the 1960s, where social equality and integration was the boogie word, boogie person, right? Such that you open up all of these segregation academies, some of which are still open. They're open now just as private schools, but they had their origin in this moment where the boogeyman wasn't critical race theory. It was the Negro who's going to be coming to school with your daughter. How do we get a grip on the metastasizing of this Christian nationalist politics to then demonize areas of study and inquiry, to then also demonize wholesale communities?
Yeah, metastasize. Woo. So I think, as Dr. Grant and Maggie and Amanda were talking, I was thinking from a Christian perspective about idolatry, right? That in a real way, Christian nationalism is idolatry of number one, racism and white supremacy, white American exceptionalism, and the ways in which many in our country have embraced this idea that all of the promises of American democracy really is just for white people. And particularly, I would even say white men, first and foremost, right? And the rest of us just kind of get in where you can, but it really isn't for you. And so, critical race theory is really, many of us on this call will be familiar with it, but really is was a way of teaching in law schools. It's certainly not in any curriculum in the K through 12, but just talking about how laws were codified in Jim Crow and in other ways to maintain a racist system and to make sure that Black folks in particular and others as a result were not able to live this American dream. And so when we're talking about the public square, when we're talking even about Christianity, so my background, I'm Baptist like Amanda. And so part of me always wants to have these come to Jesus moments where it's like, you can, I know everybody doesn't believe in hell, and I mean that in the biblical sense, but there are ways that we really do reap what we sow, or that we sow that there are seeds of discord and seeds of idolatry and racism that really is playing itself out over and over again in our country. And the way we can really begin to uproot this is we have to deal with it, right? We don't teach about Black history, but make sure it is taught in our schools, and not just Black history, but Indigenous history and Latinx history and others, because of the ways in which it has all brought us to this place, right, where we are now. I think once we ignore, and this push to ignore the realities of Christian nationalism, of, we say that we believe in the Imago Dei, so that we all are the image of God, but the way we act is that only some people are, and the rest of us are not. And so the people who are really in the image of God, in this situation in America, the white, particularly male people, they get to decide how the rest of us worship, how the rest of us vote, how the rest of us engage in the public square, how the rest of us do church, how the rest of us participate in democracy, right? Like, they are the standard bearers and the rest of us are other than that. And that is a lie. And in the beginnings of unraveling this, of decentering it, to use Dr. Grant's term, to really get to the crux and the core, we have to deal with racism, white supremacy, and how it's played out in white and Christian nationalism. We have to debunk these lies, and we have to do it boldly, and we have to do it fiercely and consistently, because otherwise, I remember back it was just last year, about a year ago, I believe, when people started talking about critical race theory, and we all thought, what are they even talking? Like, we didn't really, or at least I will say, I did not necessarily think it was going to grab hold and determine elections in Virginia and all this big move in school boards and in Florida and in other places around the country. But this is where we are, because it's easier for people to embrace these lies, these myths, this idolatry, right, than it is for us to do the hard work that needs to be done to unravel it and really become the kind of democracy that we say we are. Like, America is all about being a promise that's unfulfilled, right? It's an American dream that's unfulfilled. It's a promissory note, to use that term from the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, that has not been fulfilled. And it hasn't been fulfilled in large part because of these notions that keep getting regurgitated over and over again. Like, we chew it up and it comes out differently. It comes out critical race theory is bad. It comes out Christian nationalism. It comes out in all these different ways. But at the core of it are these same central themes that we really have to unravel and root out at its head in order to really, I think, move forward.
Thank you so much, Leslie. You remind us that we really have to get to the root of these things, and this idea of Christian nationalism metastasizing as a public discourse to then demonize these discourses that are non-existent, but yet have their reference on marginalized populations. We're scared of the critical race theorists coming to your house, coming to your church, and definitely coming to your school. But it seems that there's a longer genealogy of this, particularly in our contemporary moment, that the idea of critical race theory, and I'm turning next to our dear friend Maggie, that the badness of critical race theory has a previous analog, particularly in the 21st century, in a deep Islamophobia that's been unleashed in American politics, that's been legitimated in American political life, particularly after the events of September 11th. And we're constantly seeing this. We see it, of course, in its analogs in the 1920s with the first wave of Muslims coming into the US, particularly in and around Harlem. Some of our legislative achievements on religious freedom are around Black Muslims' right to Islam in prisons in the 1960s, the 1970s with the Iran situation in the US. And of course, in popular culture, you look at the movies from the 80s and 90s, and there's always a Muslim around the corner, right? There are Muslims under the bed. So it seems like this idea that the enemy is already there. Now the enemy is critical race theory, but yet this deep religious diversity that you point to as a resource has been deemed expendable in our quest to realize a true Christian nation. How do we adjudicate that dialectic between that ideal and the ideological work that's going on in demonizing the other, whether it's critical race theory or that deep Islamophobia in the Christian nationalist ideal?
So, back when I was particularly working in Muslim community organizations, I remember there was a study that came out from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and they had done a sort of tracker of Islamophobic incidents over the years. And there were certain years where you saw a really sharp spike. And so everybody thought, okay, naturally, this is an instant where there's been a terrorist attack committed by a Muslim, or, something that would have sort of naturally caused this kind of backlash that we might expect. But no, they found that those spikes did not correlate to those incidents. Those spikes correlated to election years, big election years. So it was a profound realization, particularly when you're working at a Muslim organization, to say, here we've been condemning terrorism here, condemning terrorism there, here. We just feel like we need to get the message out. People just don't understand who we are. No. This violence is literally being perpetuated through an intentional political strategy in an election year. You need that boogeyman, as you were saying, right? And who's going to be the boogeyman, right? And in 2016, right, that was Trump's entire campaign. We're going to stop Muslims from coming into this country, right? Like all of that, he campaigned on us, right, as the boogeyman. And yeah, we absolutely, in some races, certainly in Virginia, we saw CRT playing a similar role there. And when we were speaking to some of the partners who organize with faith communities at a local level, our partners, meaning Center for American Progress's partners, they shared with us that CRT is very clearly being intentionally manufactured as a gateway to the big lie. That there were a lot of people, and in particular in their experience in some of the states we were talking to, this sort of profile of a white suburban mother who, this is a stereotype, but that's sort of like what they were saying, who didn't buy the giant conspiracy around the election. So these political actors said, how are we going to get more people to oppose voting rights? How are we going to get more people to think there's election fraud? How are we going to do that? And they found that CRT was the sort of gateway drug in. That if you reached out to these parents and you said, there's this thing, it's showing up in your kids' schools, it's going to make them feel bad, all this stuff. If you sort of like planted the seed of a conspiracy, this giant conspiracy that's happening, and they're very well funded, very organized, they're doing this in a lot of school districts at a very local level, they sort of engendered this kind of grassroots, almost like feeling of a conspiracy. And once you started believing that there's this conspiracy out there that's coming to get specifically your kids, it was very easy to say, oh, well, there's also this other conspiracy. It's even bigger, right? All these people that are for racial justice, right? They're advocating for voting rights. That's got to be a bad thing too, right? Because they just, all the stuff you already know, right? The silver lining here is when we spoke to some of these organizers about what was working, they found that in fact some really powerful faith-based organizing was what was working. When you brought people in and said, not CRT is this, CRT is that, but rather, what do you want for your child to learn? Do you want your child to learn about peace, about nonviolence? Are you worried your child is going to be a bully? Are you worried that your child might be a racist and calling people names on the playground? The answer most of the time was yes, that's a thing I'm worried about. I don't want my child to be racist. I don't want my child to be a bully in the case of parents of white children. And so they were on board with this notion of actually advocating, not for like the buzzword of CRT necessarily, but just for anti-racism education, and doing this as a practice of faith or of nonviolence that they wanted to see. And there's coalitions in some school districts of parents and educators of diverse backgrounds coming together around this, and it's effective. The challenge is always just being outfunded and all of this stuff, but the good thing is we can out organize that. Even then, we've done it time and again, you know, got like a percentage point of what the funding is on the other side, and we still beat them.
Maggie, you're right. Freedom, as Fannie Lou Hamer reminded us, freedom is an endless meeting. And what we're reminded of in this moment is that the necessity to organize, to continue to galvanize communities and inform and educate them about what's going on in our contemporary moment is so key. But I want to continue to impress this point, and my attention is turning to Sharon, because we've seen how this, what Amanda reminds us of, this deep issue of Christian nationalism, how it can morph into, you know, this CRT movement that then moves into public school, that then goes into questions of curriculum funding, funding of charter schools. There was a proposal in Virginia to have charter schools being funded through a number of public venues if parents were upset with the curriculum in the schools. Luckily, that didn't pass. We've also seen it draw on the deep legacy of Islamophobia in the U.S. It's also fueling a precipitous rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S. And it is also fueling a deep backlash against the LGBTQ movement in the U.S., deep and violence against our trans brothers and sisters. Sharon, you're in North Carolina. I'm in North Carolina. We're talking about the great wells of justice that we must draw from in order to build this inclusive democracy. But one of our guests with us asked the question, how do you do that in the Bible Belt, where our beliefs are very much, they may not be Christian nationalists. We're not going to go out and we're not January 6th insurrectionists. But at the same time, there's something wrong with our public schools. You know, diversity is good as long as it's not in my neighborhood. I welcome religious pluralism, but Christianity is the only way. How do you begin to negotiate that, particularly as an educator of faith leaders, particularly in this moment of pandemic where science is not science, it's an opinion. It's what you believe, I believe, and then we can go our merry way while the coronavirus runs rampant in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our prisons, and in our public life. How do we negotiate that terrain?
You know, we have to understand that our house is on fire. We are in a burning house. And if science is the water hose that can put out the flames so that we can live in an environment where we have some sense of safety, some sense of security, some sense of understanding that our planetary home is shared by everybody, whether you're Christians or Buddhist or trans or LGBTQ or Asian or Muslim. Our house is on fire. And so science can provide human beings with the knowledge of our biophysical environment that we require to breathe, to be able to have a cool glass of water, to be able to have food that won't kill you or make you sick. And science gives us knowledge about our social behavior, this anti-Blackness that is choking out our democracy. We can look at the work of sociologists, look at the work at economists, and look at what has been done to show how we got into this theology of a mess. But I think that what really has to happen is we have to have a model that can show us how this can be walked out. You and I both in North Carolina. It took me having to come to North Carolina to actually learn about the 1898 white supremacy campaign, where legitimately elected officials were kicked out of office at rifle point, at gunpoint. And so and we had the leaders and persons that were integral in society and part of the business of the businesses in on this. So we're not talking about just the lower echelon. We're talking about higher echelons of power that are trembling because of this racial reckoning, because of this religious reckoning of what it means to lose power because we have a pluralistic society. So I think that we need a model that can show us how this can work out. And so the center that I direct, we have used George Washington Carver as a symbol of what it looks like to be able to survive the most vile acts of trauma. He was born into slavery. He was kidnapped as an infant. He was castrated as a little boy, and yet he still found a way to leave and get educated and become a scientist and make a contribution to help the farmers in the Jim Crow South try to make a living out of the soil that had been ravaged by the cotton industry. Not only do you deplete the soil, but you deplete the people. And so his work is about how do we, and I call it the work of rehumanization. How do we create an organic matter where the soil can be reconstituted to generate life? How do we reconstitute our society to generate life for everybody? And Carver did it by understanding that we are integrated with nature. We have to understand if we don't have a planet, we don't have anything at all to fight about. So I think that we have to realize we have to get on one accord and solve our problems, and we'll do it by understanding that we have to have evidence-based arguments. We have to have logical arguments. We have to be able to have peer review. And that's what a scientific habit of mind will help us as we integrate it with the faith commitments that we have that have to be life affirming. So I hope that I've answered your question, but I believe that if we can get at understanding how we can look at evidence and peer review, then we can get around a lot of this toxic hubris that keeps us limited and moving forward, and creating the democracy that is so important for all of our, and especially our children's survival.
Sharon, you're going to keep us on point here because you're going to remind us that we not only face a deep democratic deficit in the US and globally, we also face a planetary crisis around the very future of organized human life. And if we don't deal with that planetary crisis in its density and complexity, then the question of our political life becomes even more strenuous and almost mute, because what we're facing is really what our dear friend Noam Chomsky reminds us of is what will be the future of organized human life in our moment. And that's truly and really profound. And we started this section of our conversation with some of the remarks from Amanda on Christian nationalism. And we saw how Christian nationalism morphs into the questions and issues that we're facing around the public contestations around critical race theory pulling on and exacerbating tensions within our deeply pluralist religious environment, particularly around forms of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, also deep violence against our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And of course, it obscures the real planetary issues that we're confronting and facing. And that's the crisis of our climate. But Amanda, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a bit more about this germinal report that BJC just issued that's garnered a lot of public attention, that it's even enabled us to really crystallize some of the issues that we're discussing tonight.
Thank you so much, Corey. Yes, so this report, which just came out last week, and there is a link in the chat so that you can read it on your own. It's a 63-page report, and it is the most comprehensive to date accounting of how Christian nationalism showed up, not just on January 6th, but in the events leading up to January 6th. I do not think someone can read this report and deny the fact that Christian nationalism played a role. We are not saying that Christian nationalism alone motivated the insurrectionists and the threats to democracy, but we don't think that you can understand it without really understanding Christian nationalism. This, I mentioned earlier, is a joint project between Baptist Joint Committee, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a group of avowedly non-believers, non-religious Americans. And I think this is really important, that we have a broad coalition of people of faith working with people who are non-religious to speak out against Christian nationalism. From a personal perspective, I gained new insight into what it must be to be non-religious in this country by working with the Freedom from Religion Foundation and seeing the amount of vitriol and pushback that they get all the time, questioning their status as Americans, their patriotism, and claiming that to speak out against Christian nationalism is to speak against Christianity. And so I think it's very much our role as the Baptist Joint Committee and as Christians Against Christian Nationalism to explain that no, Christians are concerned about what Christian nationalism is doing to Christianity, to our own faith. And it is because we care deeply about our faith that we are speaking out against Christian nationalism. And I think it's also important that so many people continue to be interested in learning more about Christian nationalism, many of them because of January 6th. The scale and severity of that attack got people's attention in a new way. And I think that that is a good thing, and it is important that we take that wake-up call and stay awake to the problem. So here we put this report out more than a year after the insurrection, and we had a tremendous response. We had almost 1,000 people attend our live event last week. We've had a lot of media coverage. It shows that people care about this issue. And I always want to have a caveat, though. We can't just think about Christian nationalism in its most extreme forms. We have to get at the bigger root problem of Christian nationalism, which permeates our society. And particularly we as Christians have to speak out against that. And I'm going to give you an example. You know, in listening about CRT and about Islamophobia, it's like we're playing whack-a-mole with all of this hatred that comes out in different places. And I believe, having studied it for several years now, that Christian nationalism as an ideology underruns all of this. And so we have to speak out against these instances of hate and violence. And we have to play a long game too of working to dismantle Christian nationalism. And let me just give you an example of how Christian nationalism helps provide cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. In 2020, in the election of 2020, the voters of Mississippi finally voted to take the Confederate battle flag off their state flag. But the legislature of Mississippi had one requirement, that as the voters voted on it, that it had to be replaced with the words, "In God we trust." They took an overtly exclusionary racist symbol and they replaced it with a covertly exclusionary and often racist symbol. And so we have to think again about these vestiges of civil religion and how they're working to exclude people from being fully belonging, experiencing full belonging in our society. And I think it's imperative that Christians speak up against this, because we will undoubtedly, when we start to say things, take issue with sacred cows like "In God We Trust," we will undoubtedly get pushback about how anti-religious we are. So we as religious people have to understand and speak out about how that does do harm and violence to our unity as Americans, and also to the integrity of our faith.
You're so right, Amanda. And we are reminded that those words "In God We Trust" come out of the Eisenhower administration, when it's added to our currency and becomes the motto of the United States. This is really a pushback of a particular business class. Kevin Cruz at Princeton really and eloquently dissects this and analyzes this trend of the wedding of what we can term Christian nationalism as a response to the New Deal, as well as the ways in which you want to purify the nation. So we're at a moment where we're looking at, we're going to have to put a pin and pause this conversation tonight, this evening. But we're going to have the conversation continue on, because we know that this is we have a number of questions that we can't do justice to in this moment. And what we want to do is sort of put a pause in it. We're going to capture those questions, because this conversation is going to continue. And what we want to do is have that conversation continue, not only through the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation convening more of these events, but also in local communities around the nation, because we understand that to have these courageous conversations, not only over Zoom, but more importantly, face-to-face with our neighbors, face-to-face with our community members, is vitally important. I want to move around and have us respond to how do we confront the crisis that we have in our moment in our local communities? What resources can you offer us coming out of this conversation tonight that we can then mobilize in the many towns and cities and our synagogues and our temples and our mosques and our places where we don't have any religious faith? How can we wrestle with these deep issues with the sense of what Maggie spoke to, of the ideal of building an inclusive community, the ideal of building even a beloved community? And we'll go alphabetically. And Leslie, I want to start with you on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think a couple of things, so many things occurred to me as the other panelists were talking. One of the things that I want to encourage us to do, if you're a parent or even in local communities, if you don't have a child in the school, you can be a part of the parent-teacher or parent-teacher student association. A lot of these conversations start there and move from there to school boards and into other legislatures. And as having been pretty active when my kids were in grade school, I will say a lot of things happen in those meetings that impact all children, are not equitable and not just. And if nobody is there to raise those concerns, it just happens, right? And so I have often said being a part of the PTA or PTSA or whatever your school calls it is an act of resistance and is an act of justice. And some of these conversations, I believe, could probably be headed off if more people were in those spaces at the outset. So I would offer that as a resource and as a place to start. I think we have to make sure we educate ourselves by going to the Baptist Joint Committee's website and others, reading those reports, hearing the language that is used, hearing the talking points that we hear over and over again, and pushing back on those. I think that's really critically important, whether it's science, it relates to COVID, whether it relates to the environment, whether it relates to racism, and whether it relates to theology. You know, we can be asking hard questions. Does God really not, if people are not made to pray in school, have we taken prayer out of school? Like, is that real? Is that accurate? Why do we think that? Who do we want praying with our kids in school? And under what circumstances, right? Can we teach our kids to pray at home and still get the same sort of religious upbringing that we want in our household without imposing it on others? I think there's questions that we can begin to ask. Do we go and wave the flag that says Jesus saves and kill people and desecrate the Capitol and, you know, knock out windows and have Capitol police officers crushed in doorways? Like, is that really a Christian witness? Or is there some other way that we should be showing up in these spaces and talking about our faith that is life-giving and actually reflects the character of God? So I think in terms of how do we begin to dismantle all of this, it is in having those hard conversations, and sometimes maybe having those hard conversations with ourselves about what we really mean when we say certain things and when we embrace certain beliefs that end up looking like January 6th, right? And doesn't reflect the Prince of Peace, or doesn't reflect a faith that reflects God is in all of us, and that we are all created in the image of God. So that's kind of where I would start in terms of dismantling and the resources. We at the National Council of Churches, we have a statement on Christian nationalism. You can get that. We also did a session during our Christian Unity gathering on Christian nationalism with some top thought leaders in this area, including Amanda, who was a part of that conversation. I would invite you to do that. And then we recently released a statement, voting rights are human rights. And I invite you to go and to look at that and to look at how we, from a theological perspective, begin to talk about in a democracy what it means for everybody to have a voice and to have a vote.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Sharon.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that as we look at the local level of interaction, there are already some great projects and great work going on wherever you're located. So find out what you're concerned about and then get involved. But I think what's extremely important is that we're going to have to do really serious power analysis studies. As we're looking at policies, who is actually holding the power, who's afraid of losing the power, who has no power, how are the budgets organized, how are the police being funded? Can some of those monies go to help our housing conditions? Can some of those go to help our schooling conditions? I think just being involved and being present is huge, just showing up, right? But I also want to remind us of a couple of things that our ancestor Frederick Douglass would say, that you have to agitate, agitate, agitate. Nothing happens unless you are there asking questions, pushing persons that are in power to answer questions that they don't want to answer. And then also, I would just remind us of the sci-fi writer, the late Octavia Butler, who says that as we're envisioning the future that we want to have for our children and grandchildren, she gives us 4 things to think about. And so for number 1, she says we have to learn from the past. That's why Black History Month is so important. We're learning from the narratives of those persons that have fought these fights before us. We saw how they won. We saw how they lost. We saw how they engaged in the Sisyphean task of rolling this boulder up the hill one more time to try to get America to keep its promises. Number 2, to respect the law of consequences. If you storm the Capitol, respect the fact that you'll be brought in and possibly, and certainly you should be arrested. Number 3, be aware of your own perspective. We all come into this democracy with different histories and different perspectives, and yet we all need to respect others' perspectives. And then number 4, count on the surprises. So as we're looking at our voices, our votes, and our freedoms, and we're envisioning the society that we know we can have if we will fight for it. I think that Butler's message can be helpful for us as we get involved in the local struggle, as well as keep our eye on the global struggle.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Maggie, and then Amanda.
Well, I think we need to get loud about our faith values in the public square. I'd agree with both Leslie and Sharon. All politics are local. Encourage folks to join your local Faith in Action, your local Industrial Areas Foundation affiliate, your local Interfaith Alliance, your local Interfaith Power and Light. There are a lot of faith-based social justice organizations that are organizing at a very local level as well that you can plug into to do that. Many progressive people, and I will just say many progressive white Christians specifically, are afraid of getting loud about their faith in the public square. I think very understandably, because they don't want to look like the religious right. They don't want to replicate some of these Christian nationalist tendencies. And as much as I recognize the like wonderful impulse behind that, if we do not get loud, we let religion in the public square look like one thing and one thing alone. And as long as we are engaging in such a way that we are honoring religious pluralism in this country, that we are including when we describe the vision we're talking about for America, we're including people of all faiths and none in that vision very clearly. We are not replicating what is happening on the religious right. And that's just a really important thing to do. And I think we also need to be really clear about shutting down this language of the secular left versus the religious right. Essentially, if you look at polling data, all of America's religious diversity is located on the left, quite probably because of many of the themes we've talked about today and the centering in the right of a very specific demographic. So we need to talk about the racial and religious diversity in America with regard to positions on public policy. When we talk about Christians of color, even, we often explain their political decisions based on their racial identity and not their religious one, as if white Christians bring their faith to the polls and people of color only bring their race or ethnicity, right? We need to notice those things and call out that rhetoric when we see it as well. And really bring the fullness of ourselves and our faith traditions, really own that in conversations on public policy.
If I were on Twitter right now, I would retweet as endorsements everything that has been said right now. But I will just add very briefly, I think, to that exact point, Maggie, so much of how Christian nationalism has gotten so deeply entrenched is these myths and false narratives have gone unanswered and unquestioned for too long. And so if we're going to do something, it is to start to ask questions. It's to start to get curious. It's to question these narratives, question these myths. And I would point, of course, to Christians Against Christian Nationalism, as well as BJC, but Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we have gathered in one place so many different resources for Christians and for everyone else who are looking for language about how to understand Christian nationalism. And I'm going to drop in chat as just one final resource, a curriculum that we put together that uses biblical texts and Christian theology in a way for small groups to understand Christian nationalism, and would refer that to anyone who's interested in looking for a resource that could be used on the community level.
Leslie, Maggie, Amanda, and Sharon, I want to thank you tonight. Thank you for a rich conversation. You provided us with a number of resources and a critical analysis of our moment. We have to get the language. We really have to get the language. And once we get that language and understand what we're dealing with, we're going to get loud. Like Maggie reminds us, we're going to be loud, but we're going to be local. We're going to connect with our neighbor. We're going to connect with our groups and our communities. But as Leslie reminded us, we're going to use the language, we're going to get loud, we're going to be local, but most importantly, we're going to do it all out of a deep love. Because this isn't about being right or wrong. This is about building and being a beloved community. That's the challenge. That's what we face. And that's the opportunity. Leslie, Sharon, Maggie, and Amanda, thank you for tonight. And let me turn it back over to the president for the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, Dr. Sabrina Dent, who will have some announcements for us. But I want to thank you and thank everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker, Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland, too, Dr. Grant, Maggie Chaplin, Maggie Siddiqi, Amanda Tyler. Thank you all for being a part of tonight's conversation. There's so much rich information that I heard, and Corey, you did my recap actually, because there were some things that being local, I cannot emphasize that enough. You know, getting involved with the school boards, and the center actually did that. Like we put out a public statement in response to some things that were happening here in the state of Virginia. So we're not just talking it, we're walking it in the work that we do, and that is so important. So with that, I would like to invite you to join us, because if you're really interested and engaged and wanting to learn more and to do more, I want to share with you an opportunity to join the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. They will be hosting their annual Clergy and Lay Leadership virtual conference, February 19th through the 23rd. And on February 23rd, Dr. Corey D.B. Walker and I will be presenting with Dr. Aubrey Hendricks on the topic Freedom Ain't Free, Hope for Democracy. And so again, this is a conversation, not just this one conversation, but the entire conference is an opportunity for you to engage and to learn and to listen and figure out what resources are available for you to take action in your community. I highly recommend that you register for this conference and then stay connected with the center. Visit us online, visit our website, and we're just grateful that you joined us this evening, and we hope that you will continue to stay connected with the center. Visit our website, faithandjusticerva.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, and if you're on Facebook, we do have a page as well. Overall, I hope that you take away the information and the nuggets that work for you and your community, and that should be so much because there was a lot that was shared this evening. But I just want to say again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to each person that joined us and listened, and those that submitted your questions. I will share those with the panelists, and a recording will be available at a later date if you need to watch it again to digest some of the information that was shared. So thank you to all of you. We wish you a wonderful evening, and please be safe.
Thank you.
Good
Great to be
night.
with you all.